Homework 6, section 3.4, logical arguments, video 9. In the previous video, we announced that there are some argument forms that are so common that they've been given names, and we don't have to ask are they valid or invalid. Just based on their structure, we know which one they are. We've already seen an example of what's called the law of detachment, a valid argument form. If the first premise is P points to Q, and the second premise is P, and the conclusion is Q, that will always be valid. And we also saw an example of a common fallacy, the fallacy of the inverse. Premise number 1, P points to Q. Premise number 2, the negation of P. Conclusion, negation of Q. That will always be invalid anytime your argument has that structural form. I'd like to list the rest of them. The second one is called the, let's see, which one do I want to do next? We'll call this one we'll call it what it is, the Law of Contraposition. That's a long word. Contraposition. Kind of like the word contrapositive, and you'll see why in a moment. The structure for the law of contraposition is first premise, P points to Q. You'll see a lot of them that start that way. Second premise is the negation of Q. Conclusion, negation of P. For example, if it's raining outside, then I will carry an umbrella. I'm not carrying an umbrella, then I guess it's not raining outside. That sounds logical because it's a valid argument. The reason it's called the law of contraposition, and you don't need to know this, but it's just an FYI. If you recall, the contrapositive of a conditional is where you both switch and negate the antecedent and the consequent. You may also recall that a contrapositive is logically equivalent to a conditional, which means I can replace a conditional with its contrapositive. So if I switch the P and the Q and negate both of them, I get negation Q pointing to negation P. Now, why is that important? Because structurally, this is the law of detachment. I know the symbols are different and it's loaded with negations, but essentially what the law of detachment says is if you have a conditional as your first premise, and that conditional's antecedent is the second premise, then the consequent as a conclusion is valid. So it's called the law of contraposition because if you replace the conditional with its contrapositive, you just get a tricked out version of the law of detachment. Now, if you're having trouble seeing that, wait a minute, when you switched that, it didn't look like that, but you said it was, don't worry. After I give you this list of valid arguments and common fallacies in symbols, in the next video, I'm going to give them to you in words, and it will be much clearer to see the things that we're talking about. The third common valid argument is called the Law of Syllogism. You kind of know what a syllogism is, and I'll prove it. Premise number 1, if you study hard, then you will pass the class. Premise number 2, if you pass the class, then you will make the dean's list. Conclusion, if you study really hard, then you'll make the dean's list. This is what some people call a slippery slope effect. If this happens, then that happens, but if this happens, then something else happens, and if something else happens, then something else happens. And so the conclusion is if the first thing happens, then a snowball effect, then the last thing happens. Symbolically, the law of syllogisms is premise number 1, P points to Q. If P, then Q. Premise number 2, Q points to R. If Q, then R. The conclusion that you draw is another conditional. P points to R. This is a valid argument if you have two conditionals where the consequent of the first conditional is the antecedent of the second, then you can basically remove the middleman and say that the first the first antecedent pointing to the second consequent is a valid conclusion. And the last one is called the Law of Disjunctive Syllogism. Law of Disjunctive, you know what, I'm going to write it here. Number 4 is called the Law of Disjunctive Syllogism. And as the name implies, it has something to do with the disjunction, in other words, the word or. Now this is something that you also probably already know, and I'll prove it. I'm going to say two statements, and they are both true. I want you to see if you can think of a valid conclusion. Statement number 1, I have dogs or I have lizards. Okay? Which is a true statement. Statement number 2, I don't have lizards, which is a true statement. Can you draw a conclusion? And again, here's the statements. Statement number 1, and I swear this statement is true, I own dogs or I own lizards. Statement number 2, which is also true, I do not own lizards. What conclusion can you draw? I must own dogs, and you would be correct. The Law of Disjunctive Syllogism models that symbolically. Premise number 1 is a disjunction. P or Q. At least one of them is true. Second premise is the negation of either half. We'll say the first half. One of these is true. The first one's not true. Conclusion, the second one must be true. And it really doesn't matter which one is first and which is second. I could have said, okay, this marker is about to get thrown away. I know you can't see what happened, but it hit the tray. The cap came off, the marker slid off the tray into the trash can. The lid, however, did not. It doesn't matter which one you negate. Basically, it's saying is if you have a disjunction and half of it is false, then the other half has to be true. But the Law of Disjunctive Syllogism looks like that. And again, these are all valid arguments, so any argument that translates symbolically into one of these is instantly valid. Now, what are our common fallacies? There are 3 of them. One is the fallacy of the inverse, which is already listed here. The second is the fallacy of the converse. You may recall that a converse is where you take a conditional and you switch the antecedent and consequent. Fallacy of the converse. First premise, P points to Q. Second premise, Q. Conclusion, P. Example. If I get a raise, then I will get a new car. I got a new car. Therefore, I got a raise. Is an invalid argument. Because maybe I got the other car because somebody gave it to me, or I won it. Or somebody crashed into me and their insurance bought me a new car. But there's a lot of ways I could have gotten a new car without getting a raise. The reason it's called the fallacy of the converse is because you may recall from the previous series of videos that the converse is where you switch the antecedent and the consequent, but it is not logically equivalent to the conditional. However, if you incorrectly assumed that you could switch these, you can't. But if you incorrectly assume that you did, this is the law of detachment. Conditional, antecedent, consequent. The letters are switched, but the structure is the same. So if you could form the converse, then yes, this would be a valid conclusion. However, the converse is not logically equivalent to the conditional, so you can't just switch the antecedent and the consequent, and so you can't just draw this conclusion. Very common, incorrect conclusion people draw. And the third one is called the fallacy of the exclusive or. Fallacy of the inclusive or. I believe in a previous video I mentioned that when you see the word or, logically speaking, it means the first part is true or the second part is true, or both are true. So if I said I own dogs or I own cats, that's a true statement. Why? Because I own dogs and I own a cat. Well, I should say have a dog and have a cat. So even though I said I have dogs or I have cats, it's okay if both of them are true. Inclusive or includes the possibility of both halves being true. The fallacy of the inclusive or is making the mistake that when you see the word or, logically it means one or the other, but not both. And the argument form looks something like this. It starts with a disjunction. And then I say, well, the first part's true. And the incorrect conclusion is the second part is false. I own dogs or I own cats. True. Okay. I have dogs or I have cats. True. I have dogs. Oh, then I guess you don't have cats. I'm sorry, you're incorrectly assuming that or means exclusive, one or the other, but not both. But the or is inclusive and it allows the possibility of both of them being true. So if I said, I have dogs I have dogs or I have cats, and then you find out I have dogs, you can't conclude that I don't have cats. Or allows the possibility of both of them. So those are the 7 common argument forms, 4 of which are valid arguments, 3 of which are fallacies. You won't have to memorize these. In fact, I'm going to upload a handout that has all of these listed for you. But as I mentioned before, there's a way to represent every one of these using words instead of symbols. That handout will include that interpretation of them as well. We'll see them in the next video.